Jumping right into making a two-part resin mold. What are some reasons to have a two-part resin mold? For me, I'm making crochet hooks, so most sides are of the sculpted mold, just one small area isn't. So that's going to be your rule of thumb for when you need a two-part resin mold, is if most of it is the sculpted material. So examples would be like a dice. So the first thing that you want to do is to have your master, whatever you're making that mold going to be. And then you want your container that you put the master into. And for container, you can get creative. You don't need anything fancy or 3D printer to make a box or anything like that. Just grab some scrap cardboard. You could use duct tape. I use a combination of, or not duct tape, sorry, packing tape is great, but I use a combination of the two. And then what you want to do is soften some clay. You could do various types of clay here. I'm just using some polymer clay because that's what I have handy, but use what you have available. It doesn't have to be an expensive endeavor here. After that, once you get a nice flat surface, you want to go ahead and tape it off, because for my box here, I need to get that other side all taken care of. So that way, when you pour your silicone into it, it's not going to leak anywhere. Plus, this allows me to make sure that there's not going to be any bubbles or anything, that it's all getting thoroughly coated. So once you get it all nice and secure, you want to mix up your silicone. As far as the silicone goes, I've tried a few different brands. I don't really have a preference of a particular type. Just get what you think is best. Look at reviews and what's in your price point and what kind of materials are you going to be casting. Because you could do a two-part resin mold or a two-part mold and other things for other things that aren't resin. But just follow your directions. Some require by weight, some require by volume when you're mixing it. So really, that's the most important part of this whole process, is following the directions of the silicone that you get. Now here, once you have your master, you want to make sure it's nice and snug and approximately halfway down into the clay, because that clay is acting as a barrier, so your silicone's not going to go anywhere beyond that. So this first layer that we'll be pouring is going to be the first half of this two-part mold. Now for me on this particular project, I didn't want the seam to be directly in the middle of the ghost. This is going to be a handle, and I want the front of that handle to look really clean and not have any of that seam line there. Next, you want to go ahead and create some variation within here, so that way the two parts of the mold can nicely seal. Because if you don't do this, it's just going to be like a flat surface, and it's going to be hard for you to get a tight seal on that otherwise. I just use a little ball stylus. Other people use like little marbles they'll stick in there and things of that nature. So again, use what you have on hand. Now, once you do get this and you mix up your silicone, before you pour the silicone, you want to make sure you coat very well with like a mold release. You can use multiple different types of things for mold releases. I'll show here in a second what I use, but I've used a couple different ones over the years. I actually I didn't realize this, but the mold release that I used, I didn't think about, it had it's from an aerosol can, right? And that doesn't work well with raw polymer clay, so that caused me a little bit of an issue on these molds. So if you do use polymer clay as that make the mold like I'm making, do not use something than the aerosol can. Use like powder or a different type of lubricant that isn't aerosol can like this, because that was a mistake. So learn from me. Do as I say, not as I do, is the popular saying on that. So get a good spray. As you can see, it's quite well, and I got it from different angles, because you don't want to miss a certain angle and then you end up getting some stickage and your whole silicone mold gets ruined. That would be the worst thing, especially when you have to wait 24 hours between each pour. Now next, you see me pouring out mine silicone, and I just happen to have some of the clear silicone here, so I went ahead and ended up adding a little bit of pigment to it so I can easily visually differentiate the front to the back side of my molds when together, so it takes less thought on my part. But again, that is optional. You do not have to do that. And then again, the silicone that you might be using may not be clear like this. There's a really popular one. I can't think offhand, but I can link in the description some options of silicones that I know are good, along with some mold releases that I know that are good in the description below. But the most popular silicone there is, it's like a blue in color. I've used that before. I just don't have any on hand today. So you end up seeing this clear one that I have, which is good for UV resin. So if you're doing UV resin, this would be a good one for you. And then besides following the directions of your silicone, you want to make sure you really mix it. And the same for when you get to your resin part. Mixing is one of the most important parts when dealing with this type of crafting. And as you can see here, it's a slightly purple hue because again, I added just a little bit of pigment in there just so I could differentiate easily between the front and the back. Now, when pouring, try not to pour like all over the place. Generally, you want to pour from a relatively decent height in a steady stream. And then you don't want to be moving and crossing the stream all around. So no Ghostbuster crossing streams. I do move a little bit because I can't help myself. I like to kind of fiddle with things. But luckily, it didn't cause me any problems me doing that. But generally, you don't have to do this. Again, as I say, do as I say, not as I do. But after you do this, I don't pour the whole mount at first because I don't have any kind of vacuum chamber or pressure pot, anything like that that's going to get rid of the bubbles. So I pour it in sections. So I pour it a little bit and then I tap it down like you do in baking with cookies or cakes and stuff. You pat it down to bring the bubbles up to rise to the surface. And then I go in with my little like needle tool just to pop some of the bubbles that I saw just offhand. And you can see it here. If you look very closely, there's little bubbles coming in. So that's why I did it in layers. And you want to be careful when you're doing that your silicone doesn't start to set. So be mindful of the silicone you have and how long of a work time you have with it. For me, I was very thorough about going over all the directions and I knew how much time I had. So there was plenty of time for me to go and pour in layers. I believe I did 3 layers where I would pour, hit out the bubbles, pour, hit out the bubbles, repeat until you get to the desired amount. Now, when you're doing your 2-part mold, you want to make sure that the thickness is going to have a decent thickness because you need to smash those 2 sides together. And if they're too thin, that's going to distort what you're molding. So be careful of doing that. Do not do that. You want to have a good thickness. Do not skimp out on, trying to make your silicone last longer by using less. Sometimes you do have to use a little bit more to get the desired result that you're looking for, especially with 2-part resin molds. As you see here, I have 2 different ones mixed up, and the purple one is already pretty much set up. The pink one was the newer one. Here you could see what I was talking about with the tape, where I could see that it looks good. I don't see a super ton of bubbles. There's like a little micro bubbles, but nothing too bad. Nothing's leaking. It was a good, smooth process. Hardest part is waiting for the first part of that silicone to cure. I skipped this boring part where I tore out all that clay, and it was also kind of icky because, again, I use aerosol mold release, and aerosol does not mix with polymer clay, like raw polymer clay, so bad. Do not do that. I skipped that. So once you get it all cleaned out, you flip it, and then you start the process again. Do your mold release. Get from all angles. So I spray at this angle. And then I turn it and spray it at another angle until I have a very nice coat. And you don't want to go too heavy with it either. You want a good amount, not too much, not too little. Very Goldilocks when it comes to this. you want to be able to see that there's that thin sheen layer of that mold release, just to ensure there's no stickage, because silicone is known to be bad for sticking to itself. So be careful with that. Then you mix up your second half. Again, follow the directions on your silicone and stir an adequate amount. Very important. Don't want to half stir. Once again, pour from a height. You don't have to move it around as much as I am here. But again, just make sure that there's enough distance between the subject matter that's going to be cast and how much silicone that there's going to be there. I would say you'd want at least at a minimum about a 1/4 inch. That's even pushing it. I think on these molds they ended up being at the thinnest part just over a 1/4 inch, but the thinnest part is very little. Generally they're at least 1/2 inch to an inch thick, depending on the area of the mold. Now, with these, like I said, 2-part molds are great for things that you want to have, casted all sides, or maybe all sides except for one, like these resin hooks I'm doing. So everything is that master cast in the middle, and then the only part that's going to be, accessible is where I pour in the resin, which we'll see here shortly. Now, when you add colors like I have, you can play with the swirls, make it look pretty before that silicone sets, because you have some working time depending on the silicone that you use. So for me, I did the little swirls there and made it look pretty. And then you have to wait another 24 hours later, which is one of the worst parts. Now let's take a look at how to use the silicone mold here in a moment. But beforehand, you finally finish your mold, let it cure for a full 24 hours so it's ready to use. And as you can see, the little divots that we put into it allow it to really lock well and create a nice seal. That is extremely important, especially for this type of mold where I'm going to have it sitting up and you don't want all that resin to just flow right out of it. That would be terrible. But luckily, I had no issues with these molds. So now let's take a closer look on when using your 2-part mold, and depending on the type of mold that it is, if it's a dice mold, you may not need to do this. If you're doing something like I am, then you will. So for me, what works best is tape, and it's just a packing tape. I usually use the heavy duty packing tape because it's a little bit thicker and sturdier, a little bit more rigid, and it works perfect for this use when using it for resin works, not just for this mold, but I have other purposes I use it for as well. But make sure it's a nice flush seal, and it just sticks right on there. And like I said, depending on your type of 2-part mold, you may not need to do this, or you could go do other methods. Some people use rubber bands to press the 2 halves together and seal them tight. For me, that wouldn't do. I did not want to distort my master cast in any way. But other molds like dice molds, they don't require anything too much. You just put that cap on and put it in a pressure pot and you're good to go. These are not going to go in a pressure pot or anything like that. So this is a good accessible type of craft for somebody who doesn't have those materials. So after you pour in your resin, you can see that if there's going to be any leakage through the tape, you can see that occurring. Luckily, there wasn't any here, but there was a little bit of seepage. So you have like this flash of resin, very thin, paper thin, but that's easy to just break off with your finger, like chip it off, scissors, pliers, whatever floats your boat. A little bit of sanding, a little bit of polish. You can't even tell that there's this seal there. So these were very successful molds, and I hope that yours turn out as successful with some of the advice hopefully I was able to offer. And if you did have any questions, just comment down below. If you got any benefit from this, please give me a follow and a like, and I do wish you the best of luck on your art journey.